On the morning of August 9, 1943, the face of Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen stared out from newsstands on street corners across the United States. He was the cover story of Time magazine, framed in a heroic portrait that screamed competence and victory. The headline heralded him as Allen of the First, the fighting general who was carving a path of glory through the dusty hills of Sicily. To the American public reading the article over their morning coffee, Terry Allen was the embodiment of the relentless offensive spirit that would crush the Axis powers. The article spoke of his tactical brilliance, his connection with his men, and his inevitable rise to even greater command. There was just one problem. The magazine was lying. It wasn't a deliberate lie, but a cruel trick of timing. By the time that issue hit the shelves, Terry Allen was already unemployed. 2 days earlier, in a dusty command tent in Sicily, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley had looked Allen in the eye and fired him. The man America was celebrating as a hero was currently sitting in the stateroom of a transport ship, watching the coastline of Sicily fade into the mist, stripped of his command and sent home in disgrace. He had just won the bloodiest battle of the campaign at Troina. His 1st Infantry Division, the legendary Big Red 1, had never lost a major engagement under his leadership. They had stopped German panzers that threatened to throw the invasion into the sea. They had cracked the toughest defensive lines in the Mediterranean. And yet, he was being discarded like a broken rifle. To understand this catastrophic fall from grace, one must understand the man himself, because Terry Allen was never supposed to be a general. In fact, according to the United States Military Academy, he wasn't even supposed to be an officer. He arrived at West Point in 1907 with a pedigree that should have guaranteed success. His family had worn the uniform for 4 generations. His father was a colonel, and his grandfather had fought at Gettysburg. But Allen possessed a brain that refused to process written language the way others did. He suffered from severe dyslexia in an era when such a diagnosis did not exist. To the rigorous academics of West Point, he wasn't disabled, he was simply slow. He failed his mathematics and English courses. He was dismissed. Refusing to accept defeat, he fought his way back in, only to fail a second time. The Army had spoken. Terry Allen was not officer material. Most men would have walked away, crushed by the rejection of the institution they revered. Allen simply found a window to crawl through. He enrolled at Catholic University, joined the ROTC program, and secured a commission in 1912 through the back door. In the eyes of the regular Army, the West Point Protective Association, he was a second-class citizen. He was an interloper who hadn't endured the hazing and the rigor of the academy. He was a Mustang, wild and untamed. World War I proved that while Allen couldn't parse a sentence quickly, he could read a battlefield instantly. In 1918, during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, he led an infantry battalion not from a command post, but from the front. When a German machine gun bullet tore through his jaw and teeth, shattering bone and leaving him spitting blood, he refused evacuation. He wrapped a bandage around his head, bullied the field medics into letting him go, and returned to the line. His men saw a commander who was literally holding his face together but refusing to leave them. It was the birth of a legend, but it was also the solidification of a reputation that would haunt him. To his superiors, he was reckless. He drank hard, he swore loudly, and he treated the Army's precious regulations as mild suggestions rather than laws. For 20 years of peace, Allen languished in a military that valued parade ground polish over combat instinct. He was the officer you wanted in a bar fight, not at a diplomatic reception. By 1940, he was a lieutenant colonel facing a court-martial for yet another alcohol-fueled incident that offended the sensibilities of his superiors. His career was effectively over. Then George Marshall intervened. The Army Chief of Staff was a cold, calculating visionary who knew that the coming war would not be won by gentlemen. Marshall needed killers. He scanned the officer lists, looking for men who possessed the intangible quality of aggression. He saw Allen's file, the failures, the drinking, the insubordination, but he also saw the Silver Star, the Purple Heart, and the undeniable loyalty of his troops. Marshall reached down, plucked Allen from the brink of dismissal, and promoted him to brigadier general, skipping the rank of colonel entirely. It was a shock to the system. Marshall handed Allen the 1st Infantry Division, the oldest and most storied division in the Army, and told him to get it ready for war. But Marshall also promoted another man, a man who would become Allen's nemesis. Omar Bradley was the anti-Allen. A West Point graduate, a calm intellectual, a soldier's soldier who believed that discipline was the bedrock of survival. Bradley was a schoolmaster in uniform, meticulous and methodical. When the war moved to North Africa in 1942, these two distinct philosophies of war collided violently. Allen trained the Big Red One in his own image. They were arrogant, scruffy, and ferocious. They walked around with unbuttoned tunics and unshaven faces. They got into fistfights with military police in the rear areas. They looted wine shops in liberated towns. To Allen, this was just high spirits. He believed that a soldier who fought hard had earned the right to play hard. He fostered a us against the world mentality. He told his men they were the only real soldiers in Africa, and that everyone else was just cluttering up the battlefield. When Bradley took command of the 2nd Corps, becoming Allen's direct superior, he was appalled. He visited the 1st Division area and saw chaos. Soldiers didn't salute. They looked at superior officers with disdain. To Bradley, this wasn't high spirits. It was a breakdown of command. He saw a division that was dangerously close to becoming a mob. Bradley believed that if a man couldn't be trusted to button his shirt, he couldn't be trusted to hold a flank. The tension between the two men became toxic. Bradley would issue orders about uniform standards. Allen would ignore them, focusing instead on aggressive patrolling. Yet Bradley had a problem. Allen's mob kept winning. When the inexperienced American army was humiliated at Kasserine Pass, fleeing in panic from Rommel's panzers, it was Allen's 1st Division that held the line. When the time came to counterattack at El Ghoutar, Allen's men spearheaded the assault. Bradley watched through his binoculars as Allen's undisciplined troops executed complex maneuvers under fire with professional lethality. Bradley was forced to admit in his diary that for all his faults, none excelled the unpredictable Terry Allen in the leadership of troops. It was a compliment given through gritted teeth. Bradley hated that he needed Allen. The breaking point began to form during the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. Operation Husky was designed to be the first strike into the soft underbelly of Europe. George Patton, commanding the 7th Army, specifically requested Allen for the most difficult landing assignment at Gela. Patton, like Marshall, had a soft spot for Allen's bandit style. He knew that when the ramp dropped, he needed a brawler. The landing at Gela was a nightmare. The beaches were mined, the surf was rough, and the Luftwaffe was strafing the shoreline. But the real crisis came on D+1. The Hermann Göring Division, an elite German armored unit, launched a massive counterattack designed to push the Americans back into the sea. Tiger tanks rolled over the dunes, crushing infantry foxholes. The situation was critical. There was no American armor ashore yet to stop them. Allen was on the beach, walking upright among the exploding shells, a Thompson submachine gun tucked under his arm. He rallied his men not with speeches, but with presence. He directed naval gunfire from offshore destroyers, calling down devastation on the German tanks mere yards from his own positions. His infantry fought tanks with bazookas and gasoline bombs. It was a savage, chaotic brawl, exactly the kind of fight Allen thrived in. By sunset, the German panzers were burning wrecks. The beachhead was secure. Even Bradley later admitted that he doubted any other division could have repelled that charge. Allen didn't stop. He drove the Big Red One inland, pushing them relentlessly across the jagged, sun-baked mountains of Sicily. The heat was oppressive, malaria was rampant, and the Germans were fighting a brilliant withdrawal, making the Americans pay for every ridge in blood. The campaign culminated at Troina, a mountain fortress town that became the scene of the fiercest fighting in the Mediterranean theater. For 6 days, Allen hurled his regiments against entrenched German paratroopers. The artillery barrages were constant. The casualties were horrific. It was here that the divergence between Allen and Bradley became insurmountable. Bradley watched the casualty lists mount and felt that Allen was losing control, that he was becoming too independent, ignoring the broader Corps strategy to fight his own private war. Allen, exhausted and suffering from the same fatigue as his men, felt that Bradley was a micromanager who didn't understand the reality of the front line. On August 6, 1943, Troina finally fell. The Big Red One had cracked the German line. The road to Messina was open. It was a monumental victory, achieved through sheer grit. Allen believed he had proven his critics wrong once and for all. He had taken the toughest assignment, faced the best German units, and won. The next morning, the summons came. Allen was ordered to report to Bradley's 2nd Corps headquarters. He assumed it was for a strategy briefing on the final drive to Messina. He dusted the pulverized rock of Troina from his uniform, climbed into his jeep, and drove to the rear. The meeting was short, brutal, and devoid of emotion. Bradley did not congratulate him on Troina. He did not pin a medal on his chest. Instead, he told Allen that he was being relieved of command, effective immediately. His assistant division commander, Teddy Roosevelt Jr., was also fired. The reason given was vague: war weariness and a need to restore discipline. Bradley told him that his successes had been overshadowed by his failure to be a team player. He said that Allen had allowed the 1st Division to think they were bigger than the Army. Allen stood there, stunned. The silence in the tent was deafening. He had just delivered the keystone victory of the campaign, and his reward was a ticket home. He tried to protest, but Bradley's mind was made up. The decision had the backing of Dwight Eisenhower. The system was reclaiming control. The Maverick had served his purpose. Now he was a liability. The news spread through the 1st Division like a funeral dirge. Hard-bitten sergeants, men who hadn't cried since childhood, wept openly. They weren't just losing a general. They were losing the old man, the guy who stood in the chow line with them, the guy who bled with them. They felt betrayed by the high command. As Allen's jeep drove away from the division CP for the last time, troops lined the road, standing in silent tribute, their uniforms dirty, their faces unshaven, a final act of defiance against the spit-and-polish generals who were taking their leader away. On the transport ship heading back to the States, Terry Allen sat alone. He was 55 years old. In the eyes of the military, he was an old man, a used-up tool of war. He looked at the water and thought about the telegrams he would never send to the families of the men who died taking Troina. He felt the crushing weight of failure. He didn't know that thousands of miles away, printing presses were churning out copies of Time magazine with his face on the cover, celebrating a career that was already dead. He assumed he would spend the rest of the war pushing papers in some obscure training camp, a footnote in history. But Terry Allen had forgotten one thing. George Marshall was still watching, and the Chief of Staff had a very different opinion about what makes a winning general. As the ship plowed through the Atlantic swell, carrying a broken man back to an uncertain future, the second act of Terry Allen's war was already being written in the corridors of the Pentagon. The schoolmaster had won the round, but the war wasn't over. Terry Allen stepped off the transport ship in New York Harbor in late August 1943, a man in limbo. The press mobbed him, flashing bulbs popping, reporters shouting questions about his heroic victories in Sicily. The Time magazine cover had done its work. To the public, He was a conqueror returning home for a victory lap. Allen played the part. He smiled, he waved, he praised his troops. He said nothing about being fired. He said nothing about the humiliation of standing in Bradley's tent and being told he was unfit to lead. He swallowed the bitterness and played the good soldier. Inside the Pentagon, however, his fate was being decided. The West Point Protective Association wanted him gone. He was an embarrassment to the establishment, a reminder that the rules didn't always work. They wanted to stick him in a training command in Texas, far away from the headlines, until he retired. But George Marshall had not forgotten. The Army Chief of Staff read the reports from Sicily differently than Omar Bradley did. Bradley saw indiscipline. Marshall saw results. Marshall saw a general who had taken a division of rookies and turned them into the finest assault force in the Mediterranean. Marshall knew that the invasion of Europe, Operation Overlord, was coming. It would require leaders who could fight in the mud, who could improvise, who could win ugly. He wasn't about to let one of his best pit bulls rot in a desk job. On October 15, 1943, less than 2 months after being relieved, Terry Allen stood on a wooden platform at Camp Adair, Oregon. The wind was cold, blowing through the tall pines. Stretched out before him were 15,000 men. They were not the battle-hardened veterans of the Big Red One. They were kids, draftees, clerks, farm boys, mechanics, high school students. They looked green, nervous, and soft. They were the 104th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Timberwolves. Marshall had given him a second chance, but it was a test. He was giving Allen a raw division, thousands of miles from the war, and challenging him to do it again. Allen grabbed the microphone. He didn't give a patriotic speech about saving democracy. He didn't quote poetry. He leaned forward, his voice gravelly and hard. "I'm going to work you until you hate me," he told them. "I'm going to make you so miserable that combat will feel like a vacation. But I'm going to bring you home." The training regimen that followed became legendary in the U.S. Army. Allen knew that the next phase of the war would not be fought in the open deserts of Africa or the sunny hills of Sicily. It would be fought in the freezing forests of northern Europe, in the rain, in the mud, and most importantly, in the dark. He became obsessed with the night. Standard Army doctrine called for units to train for night operations perhaps 8 to 10 hours a week. It was considered dangerous and confusing. Commanders hated it because units got lost, men got hurt, and control was impossible. Allen threw the doctrine manual in the trash. He ordered his Timberwolves to live in the dark. They trained for 35 hours a week at night. They marched through dense Oregon forests without flashlights. They learned to field strip their M1 Garand rifles blindfolded. They developed a system of clicks and hand squeezes to communicate without speaking. Allen taught them that darkness was not an enemy. It was a weapon. "The Germans are terrified of the night," he told his officers. "They rely on their machine guns and their artillery. If they can't see us, they can't kill us. We will own the night." He was ruthless. He marched them until their boots fell apart. He staged live fire exercises that were terrifyingly real. He fired officers who hesitated. But he also applied the Allen touch. He walked the perimeter wires at 2 a.m., talking to sentries. He checked the mess halls to make sure the privates were eating the same food as the colonels. He created a culture of ferocious pride. The Timberwolves began to believe they were special. They adopted a motto: "Nothing in hell can stop the Timberwolves." For 10 months, he forged them. He wasn't just building a division, he was building a vindication. Every mile they marched, every target they hit, was a silent middle finger to Omar Bradley and the generals who had dismissed him. In August 1944, the 104th Division shipped out. They landed in France in September, bypassing the glamorous liberation of Paris. They were sent straight to the front lines in Holland, attached to the British 1st Canadian Army. The Timberwolves entered combat on October 23, 1944. The mission was to clear the path to the Maas River. The terrain was a nightmare: flat, flooded polderland, crisscrossed with dikes and canals, freezing mud that sucked the boots off soldiers' feet. It was World War I-style misery. The Germans were dug in, waiting. Allen unleashed his night fighters. The attack began at dusk. The Germans, manning their machine gun nests, waited for the Americans to settle in for the night, as was the custom. Instead, shadows began to move. The Timberwolves slipped through the darkness like ghosts. They waded through freezing canals without a splash. They infiltrated behind the German lines, cutting communication wires, tossing grenades into bunkers before the defenders knew they were under attack. By dawn, the German positions were overrun. The Timberwolves advanced 15 miles in 5 days, a pace that stunned the British commanders. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, a man who rarely praised Americans, sent a message to Allen: "I have never seen such a well-trained division." But the real test lay ahead: the Siegfried Line. The German border was fortified with a belt of concrete bunkers, dragon's teeth tank traps, and overlapping artillery kill zones. It was designed to be impenetrable. Other American divisions had smashed themselves against it in daylight attacks, suffering horrific casualties. Allen arrived at the Stolberg Corridor, a heavily defended industrial sector near Aachen. The city was a fortress of factories and slag heaps, every building a potential bunker. The German 12th Volksgrenadier Division was waiting. Allen refused to attack in daylight. He waited for the sun to set. On November 16, 1944, he launched a massive night assault. It was a symphony of violence. Searchlights bounced beams off the clouds to create artificial moonlight, casting long, eerie shadows that confused the German gunners. The Timberwolves swarmed forward. They bypassed the strongpoints, isolating the bunkers in the dark, and then destroying them with satchel charges and flamethrowers from the rear. The Germans were paralyzed. Their doctrine relied on visual contact. They couldn't coordinate artillery strikes against enemies they couldn't see. Panic set in. Prisoners captured by the Timberwolves were shaken. "It's not fair," one German officer complained. "You Americans are supposed to sleep at night. You fight like gangsters." Allen pushed on. He took Stolberg. He took Eschweiler. He took Inden. He crossed the Rohr River in a daring night assault that caught the enemy completely off guard. The Timberwolves became the boogeymen of the Western Front. German radio broadcasts began warning troops about the Night Division, the wolves in the dark. But the cost was climbing. The fighting in the Hürtgen Forest and the drive to the Rhine was brutal. The 104th was taking casualties, thousands of them. The freezing winter of 1944-45, the Battle of the Bulge, the endless artillery barrages, it chipped away at the division. Allen felt every loss. His letters to families were becoming more frequent. The bravado of the training camps was gone, replaced by the cold, hard stare of a man who knew the price of every yard of ground. Yet he never lost his edge. When a corps commander ordered him to halt his advance because his flanks were exposed, Allen radioed back, "My flanks are fine. The Germans are the ones who should be worried about their flanks." He kept moving. By March 1945, the 104th had reached the Rhine. They crossed at Remagen and drove deep into the heart of Germany. They were racing now, sensing the end. The resistance was crumbling. The Wehrmacht was broken. They encircled the Ruhr pocket, trapping 300,000 German soldiers. Allen was vindicated. He had taken a green division and turned it into a juggernaut. He had proven that his methods, the night attacks, the aggressive individualism, worked. He was preparing for the final drive to Berlin, expecting one last great battle. But on April 11, 1945, near the town of Nordhausen, the war stopped being about tactics. The reconnaissance elements of the 104th reported a large industrial complex built into the side of a mountain. It was the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. Terry Allen drove his jeep to the gates. He had seen death before. He had seen the slaughter of World War I, the corpses in the desert of Africa, the frozen bodies in the Ardennes. He thought he was immune to horror. He was wrong. Inside the camp, they found the apocalypse. 3,000 corpses were stacked like cordwood in the open air, rotting. 750 survivors were wandering the grounds, living skeletons, their eyes hollow, too weak to speak. They had been slave laborers, forced to build V-2 rockets in underground tunnels, worked to death in the dark, starved, beaten, and executed. Allen got out of his jeep. He walked among the dead. The stench was unbearable. Tough sergeants, men who had killed Germans with their bare hands, fell to their knees and vomited. Others wept openly. The glory of war evaporated instantly. This wasn't a military objective. It was a crime scene. Allen ordered the mayor of Nordhausen and the male citizens of the town to be brought to the camp. He forced them to walk through the piles of bodies. He forced them to bury the dead with their own hands. He wanted them to see. He wanted them to smell it. For Allen, it was a breaking point. All the arguments about discipline, about salutes, about uniforms, it all seemed so petty now. This was what they had been fighting against. This was the true face of the enemy. It wasn't a panzer division. It was this. The Timberwolves spent days caring for the survivors, feeding them, giving them medical aid. It was the most important mission they ever undertook. They saved lives not with rifles, but with compassion. When the division moved out again, driving east toward the Mulde River, there was a new coldness in their fury. They weren't fighting for territory anymore. They were fighting to end it. On April 26, 1945, the Timberwolves linked up with the Soviet Army at Prech. The war in Europe was effectively over. Terry Allen stood on the banks of the Mulde. His division had fought for 195 consecutive days of combat. They had captured 51,000 prisoners. They had advanced hundreds of miles. And they had done it Allen's way. He had taken the rejects, the draftees, the kids nobody expected much from, and he had built a legend. He had answered his critics not with memos, but with victory. But as he looked at the celebration, the Russians and Americans drinking toasts, the soldiers firing into the air, he knew the cost. 1,445 of his Timberwolves were dead. 4,800 were wounded. He had brought them home, as he promised, but not all of them. The war ended. The parades began. But for Terry Allen, the real victory wasn't the medals or the applause. It was a letter he received years later from a former private in the 104th. "General," the man wrote, "I hated you in Oregon. I hated the night marches. I hated the rain. I thought you were a sadist. But when we hit the line in Holland, and I saw the other units getting cut to pieces in the daylight while we slipped through the dark, I realized something. You weren't trying to kill us. You were trying to save us. Thank you." Terry Allen, the general who couldn't read well, read that letter, and he wept. The guns fell silent in Europe in May 1945. The 1,000-year Reich had ended in rubble and ash. For millions of soldiers, VE Day was a moment of delirious joy, a promise of returning to girls they hadn't seen in years, to jobs at gas stations and law firms, to a life where no one was trying to kill them. But for Major General Terry Allen, the silence was deafening. He was a creature of conflict. He had spent his entire adult life preparing for, fighting in, or thinking about war. He had been forged in the trenches of World War I, tempered in the deserts of North Africa, and hardened in the forests of Germany. Now, at the peak of his vindication, with the 104th Division standing victorious on the Mulde River, the music stopped. The breakup of a combat division is a kind of death. The 104th, Timberwolves, the unit Allen had built from frightened draftees into the most feared night-fighting force on the continent, was dismantled. The men went home. They took off their patches. They put their uniforms in mothballs. Allen stood on a parade ground in San Luis Obispo, California, in late 1945 for the final deactivation ceremony. He watched the flag come down. He looked at the faces of the men he had screamed at in the Oregon rain, the men he had led through the freezing hell of the Siegfried Line. They were civilians now. He was alone. Allen retired from the Army in 1946. He moved to El Paso, Texas, a place that suited his soul, dry, rugged, and close to the border cavalry posts of his youth. He tried to live a quiet life. He worked in insurance, sat on civic boards, and played the part of the distinguished retired gentleman. But those who knew him saw the restlessness. He was a lion in a zoo. He would sit on his porch, looking out at the desert, perhaps replaying the decision at Troina, or the night assault at the Roar River. He watched from a distance as his nemesis, Omar Bradley, ascended to the very pinnacle of power, becoming the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and a 5-star general of the Army. Bradley, the schoolmaster, the bureaucrat, the man who had fired him, was running the military. Allen, the fighter, was selling insurance. History, however, has a way of balancing the scales, even if it takes decades. As the years passed, a strange thing began to happen. The polished memoirs of the Eisenhower era began to fade, and military historians started digging into the actual combat reports. They looked at the casualty rates, they looked at the objectives taken, and they realized that while Bradley was a master administrator, Terry Allen was a genius of battle. The night-fighting doctrine he had pioneered, the idea that American soldiers could operate effectively in zero visibility, using stealth rather than brute force, became the gold standard. The U.S. Army began to realize that Allen hadn't been undisciplined. He had been ahead of his time. He was the grandfather of the modern Ranger, the spiritual ancestor of Special Forces. But the war wasn't done with the Allen family yet. It demanded one last blood sacrifice. Terry Allen had a son, Terry de la Mesa Allen, Jr. The boy had grown up in the shadow of the legend. He had seen his father on the cover of Time magazine. He had heard the stories. It was inevitable that he would wear the uniform. Terry Jr. went to West Point, graduating in 1952. He was a good officer, brave, competent, and eager to live up to the name. He rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel. In 1967, another war was raging, this time in the jungles of Vietnam. It was a war of shadows, of ambushes, of an enemy that vanished into the terrain. It was exactly the kind of war Terry Allen Sr. would have understood. Terry Jr. was given command of the 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry Regiment, a unit of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, the same division his father had led in North Africa and Sicily. The symmetry was poetic. The son was commanding the father's old regiment. They even called themselves the Black Lions. On October 17, 1967, Terry Allen Jr. led his battalion on a search and destroy mission near the village of Ong Tan. They were hunting the Viet Cong. But in the dense jungle, the roles were reversed. The hunters became the hunted. The battalion walked into a massive, well-concealed ambush by an entire Viet Cong regiment. The enemy was dug into bunkers, invisible, waiting. It was a daylight version of the very tactics Terry Allen Sr. had used against the Germans. The trap snapped shut. The firing was intense and immediate. Terry Allen Jr. was in the command group at the front. He was wounded almost immediately, but refused to retreat. He stayed on the radio, trying to call in artillery, trying to save his men, trying to organize a defense in the chaos. A sniper's bullet found him. Terry Allen Jr. died in the mud of Vietnam, surrounded by his soldiers, fighting a hopeless battle. He was 38 years old. The news traveled back to El Paso. The knock on the door, the telegram. The old general, now 79 years old, frail and fading, received the news that his only son was dead. It shattered him. Terry Allen Sr. had sent thousands of men to their deaths. He had written hundreds of letters to grieving mothers. He knew the cost of war better than any man alive. But this was different. This was his blood. The legacy he had built, the name he had redeemed, ended in a jungle ambush halfway across the world. The general didn't last long after that. The fire that had sustained him through the rejection of West Point, through the wound in World War I, through the firing in Sicily, finally went out. Terry Allen Sr. died on September 12, 1969, less than 2 years after his son. They buried him in the Fort Bliss National Cemetery, and in a final, tragic reunion, the Army brought the body of Terry Allen Jr. home to lie beside him. Father and son, the general and the colonel, the architect of victory and the casualty of defeat. 2 generations of warriors resting side by side in the Texas dust. So, what is the verdict on Terry Allen? For decades, the narrative was controlled by Omar Bradley. In his memoirs, Bradley painted Allen as a talented but flawed troublemaker, a man who couldn't play by the rules. Bradley was the GI general, the sensible, calm professional. Allen was the wild card. But walk into a command post in the U.S. Army today. Look at the training manuals for the Rangers, the Delta Force, the Navy SEALs. Read the doctrine on night operations, on small unit initiative, on aggressive patrolling. You won't find Omar Bradley's fingerprints there. You will find Terry Allen's. Bradley's war was a war of logistics, of supply lines, of massive armies moving in broad fronts. It was a war of management. But the wars America fights today, wars against insurgents, wars in the dark, wars where individual initiative matters more than uniform inspections, are Terry Allen's wars. He proved that there is a place in the military for the Maverick. He proved that sometimes the West Point way is the wrong way. He showed that a commander who loves his men enough to let them break the rules, but trains them hard enough to keep them alive, is worth 10 generals who worry about salutes. Allen never got his 3rd star. He never commanded an army group. He never sat in the Pentagon and moved pins on a map. He died with the rank of Major General, the same rank he held when he was fired. But titles are temporary. The respect of the soldier is eternal. There is a story from the reunion of the 104th Division, years after the war. An old veteran, a man who had lost a leg in the Siegfried Line, was asked about Terry Allen. He didn't talk about the general's drinking. He didn't talk about the discipline problems. He simply said, "He was the only general I ever saw who looked like he was fighting the same war we were." In the end, that is the only epitaph that matters. The schoolmaster, Omar Bradley, got the accolades and the promotions. He got the glory. But the Maverick, Terry Allen, got the soul of the Army. And somewhere in the dark, wherever American soldiers are painting their faces and checking their gear before stepping out of the wire to hunt the enemy, the ghost of Terry Allen is walking point, leading them into the night.